like everything's working. So how was everybody's weekend? I'm waiting to hear somebody gripe about the quiz. Did no one find the mistake on the quiz?
The one that just came out?
The one that we just did on Friday. There's an error on the quiz. One of the other classes caught it, one student caught it. Off the top of my head, I can't remember what grades look like on this. Who thought they got it perfect but missed one? How many people? Anybody? Nobody? You did? Let me think. Did you miss the one about the navigation acts? How many people missed that one?
Because I thought I got at least 2 wrong, but I got 3.
Okay, that's probably what it is. The reason I'm squinting is I'm wearing my reading glasses, so you guys look like a blur in the back of the room. Yeah, I committed an anachronism. I talked about all things having to pass through the UK. What's the UK? We use that commonly now to mean what? What country? Huh? England. It's the United Kingdom of England, Scotland, and Northern Ireland, or the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland now. But the UK didn't exist in the time that I'm writing about. It should have said England, not the UK. So I've already done it for one class, but I'll change everybody's grade. I'll kick everybody's grade up by 10 points. Because my mistake, not yours. I also forgot to turn on the Unit 4 notes. Somebody caught me at that, and I fixed that this morning. I think you can see them all. We're getting really, really close. We're within about, I think next week we have our first exam. If we get there, hopefully we will. What I want to do this time is talk about external influences on the revolution. So I've tried it about 3 different ways in each class. I'll try it another way in this class to try and get through it all without. And when I get home, I am going to write a timeline about it, because there's a lot of things that happen. There's 2 kinds of external influences on the American colonies during this period of time. And listen to the words I say while I'm doing this log on here. The first influence on the colonies is kind of a strange influence. It's the influence of neglect. In other words, things are going on in England and in Europe that caused the British government, or the English government, there I go again, it's not British yet, the English government to ignore the colonies. So the colonies are left alone to grow as they will. The other kind of influence is where wars that are going on in Europe kind of spill over to the colonies and cause trouble in the colonies. One way is that it's always between England and France, and they're friends at the time, and sometimes they switch around. There's only about 70 or 80,000 Frenchmen in the French colonies, and there are about 1 million or more Englishmen in the English colonies. So how are the French going to fight it if they're going to fight over there? What are they going to use as their weapon? Okay, you're a French general. How am I going to cause trouble? I just want to cause a lot of trouble for the British colonies. How am I going to do it? What am I going to use to help out? Say it. Indians. Because, of course, as you may have noted on the quiz, they're the most interdependent of all. I mean, the Spanish just beat up on the Indians. The British tried to move them away. But the French have this relationship with them that they try to nurture because it means more fur. And they're going to use the Indians, especially the ones that we'll lump together and call the Hurons. That's actually a lot of different tribes, to attack English colonies. And we'll get into that. But the actions of the, hello, doesn't like me. I'll try and blend in. Then when you talk about external influence, and since we're talking about English colonies, it's going to be mainly English. But when you're talking about that, you've got the ones that really originate from England, and then you've got the effects of these wars that England's fighting. So two kinds of that, aside from, other than that, neglect. Because for a lot of this time, England's going to be very, very much focused on trying to deal with things that are going on at home. None of the other colonies get that. I mean, even the French, even though they kind of ignore their colonies a little bit too, they still have fairly rigid lines of control once they start getting cities like Quebec and places like that. And the Spanish, of course, have very rigid lines of control. But the English, a lot of the colonies were charter and kind of had their own governor and went their own way. And the proprietary colonies, of course, they went their own way. So they're freer to develop, especially when the English weren't paying attention to them. Let's see if I can find this thing. Hello. The set of slides I'm looking at right now is still in Unit 3, and it's external influences. Let's see if I can find it. There it is. It's I think down at the bottom of the file in Unit 3 lectures. And I'm going to skip all the way up to number 19, I guess, somewhere in that area, 16. And we'll look at that. That kind of summarizes it right there. What's going on in Europe? There's a 30 Years' War going on. Thank you. There's a 30 years war going on that started out as a religious war but ends up being a territorial war. There's one I didn't even put on here. There's an 80 Years' War going on which ends at the same time as the 30 Years' War. That's the Dutch fighting for their independence. There are 3 British civil wars in between 1642 and 1660. There's something called the Glorious Revolution when the It's the second time inside the same century where the British are going to kick their king out. And then there's a series of wars in roughly the same time frame called the Anglo-Dutch Wars, where the British and the Dutch are fighting because the British are trying to become dominant in trade. And of course they have a closed system of trade, but in truth the Dutch have been doing a lot of the transportation of their trade in and out of the British Isles and even over to the Americas. And when Oliver Cromwell is running the country, and we'll get to that in a second, he shuts that down, or attempts to shut that down, by passing the first Navigation Act. Okay, let's see. War of the Three Kingdoms, what's that all about? England, Ireland, and Scotland. And the guy in the painting on that slide, it's the same guy. Don't need to get into a whole bunch of it. If you look down at the bottom of the page, the First English Civil War and the Second English Civil War both started by Charles I, and he's fighting against Parliament. Parliament holds his purse strings, they won't cooperate, he sends them home until he needs money, then he calls them back into session, give me money, they tell him no. There's a lot of pushing and shoving about that. There's lurking in the background, there's the religious issue, because Charles is a little bit closer to being Catholic than they like. But mainly it's money and control. And the Stuarts all feel that they're divinely sent to be kings. And Parliament doesn't agree with that. Parliament, in all of Europe, I think, in England they had more representational government than any other place. And even so, it wasn't truly representational. It was basically the elite class that ran Parliament. But the king can prorogue, which is to tell Parliament to go home. He can convoke them, he can order them to come back. He only ordered them to come back whenever he needed money. Eventually he's going to prorogue them, and they're going to refuse to quit. They have a session of Parliament called the Long Session. And the king's going to use his connections in Scotland and other places and France. He's the cousin of the King of France, King Louis XIV. He's going to use those connections to try and get support to shut Parliament down permanently, to overpower them. Parliament raises an army, just for fun. They had names, the people that supported the king, to identify themselves, because all the English people looked the same. They grew long hair, kind of in the style in court at that time, and the people that were on the parliamentary army shaved their heads. Kind of our first homies, I guess, you know. I don't know if they wore earrings and stuff like that. Charles I is going to lose the First War. He's going to be overpowered. Parliament's got him in their control. They say, behave yourself or else. You can still be king, but behave yourself. And he says, okay, I'll behave. And within a few days of saying that, he's back in touch, secret communication with Scotland and other places, saying, get ready. We're going to do this again. And a war breaks out again in 1648. The first one ended about 1647, I want to say. It says 1646 on this slide. War breaks out again in 1648, and once again the king gets whooped, but this time when Parliament captures him, they put him in jail, and they put him on trial for treason. He's convicted and sentenced to death and executed. Funny thing about the English, you know, they think they're so civilized. I dispute that a little bit, but they went into shock that they killed their own king, even the ones that advocated killing him. And they're going to have a period of time in between his death in 1649 and 1660, when they have no king, and they call that the interregnum. Where's it? There you go. There's a slide that's got that word on it. Parliament will be in control. Now, after Charles I is executed, his son ascends the throne automatically because he's his son. That would be Charles II. But instead of ascending the throne and behaving himself, he tries to carry on like his father and raises an army, and he ends up getting away. He had to run for France, where he's going to hang out with his cousin, Louis XIV, with his family and other people that joined him there. His younger brother James. Oliver Cromwell, in about 1652, I'm going to say 1652 or 53, will assume the leadership of Parliament. What the army does is they weed out Parliament, get all the weaklings out, or the people that don't support him. So they have what they call the Rump Parliament. It's a very small Parliament, and they do what Oliver Cromwell tells them to do. Two things he does. Well, one thing that he does, he gets a Navigation Act passed, which is on your list of Navigation Acts. That's the one in 1651. And then other than that, I'm trying to think of any. Let me see if I can think of anything else that Cromwell does that we care about. Things happen as a result of them being there. Bear with me as I go flying through slides. He gets in a fight with the Dutch because he passed that Navigation Act, and that's the first Anglo-Dutch War. At the end of that war, nothing much is settled. I guess you could say the British came out on top of it, but it's hard to say because the Dutch have good ships and good ships captains, and maybe it was just a draw. When he dies in 1658, they make his son the Lord Protector. I mean, that's all they know how to do, right? You take the king's son and make him the king afterwards. So they did that with this dictator, only it didn't work. His son was hapless, lucky to be able to tie his own shoes. If they had laces in, I don't know. So they fired him and sent a message over to Charles II, who was hiding out in France. Come on over, you can be king. Which he did, and he brought his brother James and their families and all that, and he's on the throne of England. So ignoring the colonies is going to stop right there in 1660. But other things will be distractions as they go along. In 1660, I'm going to skip down to a slide that kind of summarizes what the wonderful things that Charles II did. First of all, he marries a Portuguese woman by the name of Catherine of Braganza. She's the daughter of the King of Portugal. She's not just some lady he found down there. In 1662, as soon as he gets back in 1660, he's going to establish the Royal African Company, which is, its entire purpose is to enter into the slave trade and gold and ivory, but basically slave trade. He's going to pass 3 Navigation Acts, including that one that everyone didn't notice was the Staple Act of 1663. The one that says not only do you have to use British ships when you're doing business with us, but if you want to import anything into the American colonies, it's got to first go through England on the way, which really raised the value or the cost of things that you were importing to the point that the colonists got really upset. Not to mention other people on the outside that were affected by that. Other little things he did that I care about. As soon as he got on the throne in 1660, he gave 8 people that had helped him get back on the throne. He gave them this big hunk of land that we'll call the Carolinas. We talked about that. We were talking about Carolina colony. He's going to give his brother James the Dutch colony, the colony they call New Netherlands. They'll change the name to New York because his brother James has the position of the Duke of York. He'll also grant a colony to a fellow by the name of Sir William Penn, to whom he owes money, and that will become Pennsylvania. When we've talked about that as well. He also launches or is involved in 2 more of the Anglo-Dutch wars. I'm gonna go back so I can get the years right. I've got lots of slides about the wars. You can look at them if you feel so inclined. Now, the first one was fought while Cromwell was around. When Charles II gets on the throne in 1665, the English have been trying, not so subtly, to dominate trade over the sea, but the Dutch have better ships and better captains and all that. The Dutch make a bit of a mistake. A lot of the ship's captains tell the government, the Republic's government, that we need bigger ships because we're going to start having trouble with the English. And they don't listen to them because all they're interested in is how much money they're spending on things. The English start figuring out ways to capture Dutch ships without actually openly going to war. They use privateers and all sorts of things like that. And eventually, war is going to break out, and the English will do quite well at the beginning of the war, but they have a couple of problems that are going to weaken them. One, the plague hits London, and they're in bad shape because of the plague. And the other one is the Great Fire of London happens in 1666. And the Dutch think, aha, God has answered our prayers, and they're going to attack the English and wipe out the main part of the English naval fleet. They'll steal their two best ships. One of them they sank, the other one they changed its name and used it in the Dutch Navy, which is a super embarrassment for the British. Now the British people don't want to go to war with Holland anymore, but King Charles II, since he's the cousin of Louis XIV, has made a secret deal with Louis XIV. It's called the Treaty of Dover. It stays secret for many, many years after that. He was short on money. He sympathized with the Catholic cause. So he promised Louis XIV, if you give me a little salary on the side, I will eventually convert openly to Catholic, and if you get in a war with the Dutch, I'll help you. Our Navy will help you. The English people didn't really want to go back to war with the Dutch. But eventually France is going to decide they want to nibble off a piece of the southern end of Holland. And this treaty is invoked, so Charles II has to send British naval ships over to help. The Dutch get pretty desperate. France certainly has more resources than they do. And what they do is, you remember Holland's below sea level. So they popped open the dikes and they flooded the land in front of the French advance, so the French couldn't advance anymore. And finally the French gave up. It was just too much trouble, leaving the British hanging there because they've been helping them all along. But eventually the British negotiate their way out of this. Now, as a result of these wars, let's see, the British have New York. The British finally have to tell the Dutch, okay, you can do trade with the American colonies, you can do trade with England directly. We'll make you an exception to the Navigation Acts. What else can we say? Well, let's look at another kind of war, the colonial wars of empire, which are happening all along the same period of time. The first one breaks out at the end, late in the 1600s, so after these first three Anglo-Dutch wars. There'll be a fourth Anglo-Dutch war, and some people say a fifth and sixth, depending on how you count. We don't need to worry about that now. The first war that breaks out, we'll call King William's War. Let's talk about the British royal family for a minute. We know that the first Stuart king was James I. The second Stuart king was Charles I, got his head chopped off. Then he's gone. His son comes back. That's Charles II. He dies in 1685. His brother James takes over as James II. And just spoiler alert, I'm going to tell you something in advance. James II is going to get fired. And his daughter, Mary, and her husband, William of Orange, Dutch guy, by the way, they're going to take over as King and Queen of England. Co-regnate. Both of them have the power of being a reigning monarch. It's not like the Queen and her husband or the King and his wife. They're both monarchs. When both of them die off, her younger sister Anne will become Queen of England. When Anne dies, there's a problem because her closest relatives are all descendants of James and they're all Catholic. So they have to go down to about number 32 in the line, 32nd person down the line in closeness to her, lives over in what we now call Germany. I've got to slide them just to show you so you see what I'm talking about. We'll go back and finish the words in just a second. She is I think the Duchess of Hanover. She's the first one they can find in the line that's Protestant, not Catholic. But before she can come to England, become queen, she dies. In fact, I think she died a little bit before Queen Anne died. And so her son comes over. And his name is George. He becomes George I of England. Can't even speak English, but he's on the throne. The only reason I mention, go all the way up there, he's the first king of the House of Hanover. His son will be king when we fight one of the wars I'm about to talk about. So these wars of empire start while William and Mary are still alive. They call it King William's War. It starts in 1689, ends in 1697. Let's talk about what happens to us during that war. First of all, the French come over and grab all the Hudson Bay fur trading posts up in the Hudson Bay that belonged to the English. The reason they're fighting, by the way, is the English and others don't want France to expand anymore. They're getting too big for their britches, so they try and limit that. It'll be England, Spain, Sweden, Austria against France. The French will get the Hudson Bay trading posts. They'll excite the Indians and start using them as weapons, weaponizing them against the English. The British will go up and take Acadia. Let me show you where that is. Got a better map than that. Somewhere in here. There it is. There's Acadia. If you look at the side map there, if you're following on the slides, can you see it? It's right there in North America. Where'd all the people go? The French people left when the British took over. Where'd they go? Any guesses? If you say Acadia the way the British people pronounce it, you can guess pretty fast because they say that word, the people of Acadia they call Acadians. What does that remind you of? Come on, you're from the relative south. Cajuns. They went down there. A lot of them did, not all of them, but a lot of them evacuated the area of Acadia and went down to New Orleans and those environs. And they still live there. British will change the name of this place to Nova Scotia. There went a lot of other stuff under George I. But basically, that happens when Queen Anne was queen. Because after the King William's War, everyone goes back where they started. Then the Second War is going to break out in 1702. It's really about Spain. Spain's king is about to die, and he makes a young man who's the heir to the French throne, he makes him his heir. So when he dies, this young guy named Philip, he becomes Philip V of Spain. He's also in line to become the king of France. And the British don't like that, and the Austrians don't like that, and other people don't like that. So they're going to go to war again. And this is while Queen Anne is queen. It starts in 1702. right when she hits the throne. And it's just a fight over who would succeed Charles II in Spain. But it's important to you and me, well, the French are still using the Indians. The whole point of this is, why are they bothering with the American colonies? Because it will cause the English to stop fighting them somewhere else. So it disturbs life in the American colonies. They attack an English colony town, colonial town, Deerfield, Massachusetts. It is now. There were Indian attacks down around the Chesapeake Bay. They called it the Tuscarora War. About 1,000 English, well, they weren't really English ethnics, but 1,000 members of the English colony there are killed. And down south, there's attacks across our southern borders in the direction of the Carolinas. When the war ends, bear with me, it ends with a treaty, actually two treaties, one's Rastatt and the other's Utrecht. Just worry about the Treaty of Utrecht. Remember this treaty because of what it does. They stop this man from being able to be the king of two countries. They tell him, okay, you can be king of Spain, but you have to promise not to be king of France. By the way, in each one of these wars so far, the British have won. So they kind of get to say what the conditions are going to be. They let Philip become their state king of Spain. They give some Spanish territory on the Italian peninsula to the Austrians to calm them down. But they get something called the Asiento out of the Spanish. Remember now, the Spanish colonies and the English colonies are all in closed systems of trade. So, in theory, an English ship can't go do business in a Spanish colony. And the English would like ever so much to get their nose into the Spanish colonies. And what they get out of this, the Asiento, is permission to trade slaves, to sell slaves in Spanish colonies in the Americas. Remember, Charles II set up that West Africa Company to do slave trade. Well, here's our opportunity. And this is going to transform the English into the #1 slave dealing country in the Atlantic slave trade. They won't all be English ships either. There'll be a lot of ships from America doing that. This is also going to be the seeds for a future war. Again, because the Spanish really resent giving this ability to break into their closed system to the English. And the English are going to try and cheat. They're going to try and do more than just sell slaves. They're going to try and start doing import-export into those colonies and milking them of their profits. And the Spanish really don't like that. It's going to cause another war. What the British are trying to do is they're trying to dominate the world trade system. You call that a hegemony. It can be political. It can be purely economic. It's when your economy, if it's economic, your economy is able to dominate other countries' economies. Or it could be military, where you militarily dominate them. In this case, the British are trying to do it economically. You talked about the Asiento. A lot of other little complicated things we don't really care about. Now George I gets on the throne, 1714. The funny thing about that is that the person that's closest to Queen Anne, as far as being a relative, is James Stuart, her exiled father, and his son, Charles Stuart, who will later become Bonnie Prince Charlie. They tried to, each one of them launched an effort at regaining the throne of England, and they were both pretty well defeated. And they're still living with the King of France, and the King of France, his official policy is that the Stuarts are still on the throne of England. They're the rightful kings. And the Pope agreed, by the way, at the time, although they were living in exile in France. When George dies, his son, George II, becomes king of Great Britain and Ireland. He can speak English as opposed to his father. Parliament didn't let him control much in England, but he controlled a lot of foreign affairs. Now, both of the Georges are still the electors, were still the people that more or less ruled Hanover over in what we now call Germany. And when turmoil happens in Europe, they're very, very worried about that. And so, when their little piece of Europe cries for help, they're going to stick their nose into what was essentially just a mainland European fight. And he's going to actually lead the British Army in fighting in Europe. Last king that I know of in history that actually led his own soldiers in the battle was George II. But they're not just going to fight there in Europe. All of these wars took place wherever British and French bumped into each other. It could be in India, it could be further east, but a lot of it was in the Americas. Most of it, the majority though, was in Europe itself. And we got the fallout of it. In this case, we're going to call this war, we call it King George's War, but it's also called the War of Austrian Succession, and it's all about, it starts out over this woman becoming the Grand Duchess of Austria, the Queen of Hungary and Bohemia, and eventually, because of those positions, she naturally would become the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. And a lot of Europeans don't want her in that job. There's going to be a big changeover because the English have been supporting her all along, or supporting her family all along. They're going to switch friends. And the reason they are is because they fear, or the king fears, that Austria will threaten Hanover, his old homeland. And he's going to take the side of a newly rising power called the Prussians. And they're led by a king that in later years we started calling Frederick the Great. And eventually Prussia will expand and gain control of most of German-speaking Europe, except for Austria. That's in the future a little bit. What the English are going to do in this third of these wars is they're going to try and hit the Spanish and the French wherever they can, soft targets. That's the old rule of world strategy, always attack soft targets. It's what terrorists do. They're going to go after the pocketbook of the Spanish by attacking some of their colonies in South America. They're actually going to get to their pocketbook, but it's not because of these attacks. They're fighting in the middle of Europe. Most of the British land forces are there with the king, but their fleet can't get to the middle of Europe, so their fleet's at loose ends, so they decide to send their fleet over to attack the Spanish colonies in the northern part of South America and on the Isthmus of Panama. But they don't have any spare soldiers except the Royal Marines. So what they do is the fleet under an admiral by the name of Edward Vernon comes to the American colonies and drafts American colonists to be their soldiers, which was not really popular because we're still worried about what the French are doing with the Indians. And people want to stay home to protect their families and their farms and what have you. And they're pretty resentful because the British did some pretty heavyweight arm twisting to get them on those ships to go fight down in a place they really didn't care about, down in Central and South America. They're actually going to capture a place called Portobello. It's a transshipment place for all the Spanish wealth. They'll capture that. They won't hold it. Then they're going to go over to where Venezuela is. They're going to try and capture a giant fortified port called Cartagena. It's still there in name anyway. I guess the ruins are still there. It would be in Venezuela now, I believe. They're going to fail to do that. Cartagena is too well fortified. Some colonists are going to get together up in New England, and they're going to go up and capture the French fort at Louisbourg, which is way out past the end of Newfoundland. Feel pretty proud of themselves. And at the same time all that's going on, you'll have one of those Jacobite uprisings when Charles Stuart's going to try and recapture the British throne. That's fought up in Scotland with the help of the French and some Scots and what have you, but he's going to be defeated and have to skedaddle. Actually has to hide in a hollow tree for a while the British are searching for him. They call it the Royal Oak. There's still a Royal Oak in England, although it's probably made, they claim that it comes from the acorns that fell out of the original tree, because the original tree's dead. But anyway, all these things are happening to the English in these wars, which means, once again, they're not paying much attention to the Americans, except when they need to recruit soldiers or something like that. And what you see coming out of this, eventually the English are going to win, and their allies are going to win. They also did something else. We were talking about them trying to hurt. There's Cartagena. You can, just by looking at it, you can tell why they couldn't capture it. This guy is going to do what that big fleet under Admiral Vernon couldn't do. He's going to sail all the way around the world. He's going to sneak up on the Spanish treasure galleon, and he's going to take what amounts to half of their annual income for Spain and take it back to England. And of course, he almost immediately retired and ran for Parliament, because who needs to work when you catch half of some nation's income for Captain Anson. He's the guy, the story of Captain Anson is what made me interested in studying history, because I thought it was so neat what he did. There's a big reverse in this war where the Prussians become the English ally. Something else came out of King George's War, the one that we call the War of Austrian Succession, and that was that all these American colonists were forced in close quarters with British officers telling them what to do and all that. The Americans started disliking the British, and the British started strongly differentiating between American English people and other English people. And they started calling them these Americans, and it was a disparaging way of saying it. So what you see during this war, even though we weren't at war with the British or looking for independence or anything, you see the beginnings of an identifiable difference between English and American English. Not the language, but the people. Excuse me. So, in this fight, by the way, it was Great Britain, Prussia, Portugal, and some small German states against the Austrians, the Russians, Spain, France. There was fighting over in India. The French took away part of the British colonies in India. The British took away more French possessions in North America. Then we get into the 7 Years' War. Starting way back in the 1740s, the Spanish were still angry about the asiento and having to let British slave ships come into their colonies. So they started inspecting them very carefully. They weren't at war, but they forced the British ship to let them board and make sure they weren't carrying anything but slaves. If they were carrying contraband, they took it away from them. And apparently some British sea captain decided to resist that. His name was Jenkins. And the Spanish customs officer took a whack at him with his sword, missed his head, but cut off his ear. And according to the story, and Lord knows what element of truth is involved, but this ear was preserved and made its way to the British Parliament, and a parliamentarian waved this ear around and said, "Can we let the Spanish do this to us?" And he built up support for going to war with Spain again, and they call it the War of Jenkins' Ear. And eventually it's going to turn into one of these large wars like the other ones were concerning, and it will be the 7 Years' War. And the main part of the war actually is the first one of these wars, these 4 wars that I mentioned, that actually starts in the American colony. Now the War of Jenkins' Ear was the thing of its own for a while. It will blend in though, and it will all involve all the European powers 5 different continents: Europe, the Americas, West Africa, India, and the Philippines. The only reason we can't legitimately call it a world war is because the people who are actually fighting were all Europeans. The other people just kind of were there in the way. The American part of it is kind of interesting. It starts here, down the Ohio River basin. During King George's War, at some point, the French king told the people up in Canada, or Quebec, it wasn't Canada then, said, you can have all that land down the south in the basin of the Ohio River. And they sent explorers down there, and they buried little plates in the ground to claim the land for France and all that. The very same time they did that, the British king had told the people of Virginia, you can have all that land out in the basin of the Ohio River. Problem coming. So what you get, we're going to go back and talk about this in a second, but what you get is 2 sides, one coming south, one going west, that are going to bump into each other. French got there first, set up a fort at the confluence of the Monongahela and Allegheny rivers. They make the Ohio River. That's the origin of the Ohio River. What is there? What is there now? I just told you the name of 3 rivers. That's a hint. Any football fans? What's 3 Rivers? 3 Rivers Stadium. Who's that the home of? Nobody? The Pittsburgh Steelers. It's right at the confluence. I've been there. And right where excuse me, I've been yelling too long. Right at the confluence of the Monongahela and the Allegheny River, the French put a little fort right on that point of land. They call it Fort Duquesne. They name it after their governor. Governor Dinwiddie of Virginia hears about it, and he sends this young surveyor lad who knows the country pretty well out there with some militia and some of their Indian friends to go out there and make sure that the French don't grab this land. Well, the French are already there. They get kind of a peek at this fort and decide they're outnumbered and it would be dangerous to do anything, and so they start pulling away from it. And as they pull away from it, they stumble on a French patrol over on the other side of the river, and they decide to ambush it, and they do so, and they capture some Frenchmen, and there's some people killed in the fighting and all of that. And as a result, either the first night after the fight or the second night, the allies of this young American guy that's leading decide that it's time for them to kill the French officer, eat his heart and, gain strength from it or whatever. And they do so without consulting the young American officer, which, we would consider to be a war crime. You can't kill a prisoner of war. And eventually the French are going to send a rescue party that well outnumbers the Virginians, let's call them. And they're going to get surrounded, and they're going to have to surrender. And the leader of the group is going to have to sign a letter, we surrender. And the French say, if you sign that letter, we'll let you go home and you can take your guns with you. We don't care. But just don't come back. So he signed that little thing. What he didn't realize, because he couldn't speak French, was that it was an admission of guilt of a war crime. And that's going to bug him for the rest of his life. You all know who he was, right? Who I'm talking about, this young surveyor? I'll give you a hint. He was also involved in King George's War, or the War of Austrian Succession, and served under Admiral Edward Vernon. And he named his home plantation after him. Is that enough of a hint? Who named his home after Admiral Vernon? You guys have all learned this in your little golden book of history. You've just forgotten it. Because every, 10-year-old knows this. Who named his place Mount Vernon? Nobody knows. I'm not going to tell you. You're going to have to find out. Who named his home Mount Vernon? He was a surveyor. He's going to end up fighting some more in this war. Now the British eventually are going to reinforce, they're going to bring troops over, but they're busy with the 7 Years' War in Europe. And they're losing some territory here and there. So they won't get their first team over to America. This all started in, say, 55. They won't get their first team over there until about 1759. Their general, commanding general-in-chief, you're going to figure out who this young surveyor is, because he had to go home after that, you know, and say, I got my butt whipped. And the governor says, no, never mind, you tried. Now the British are going to send, they're going to have their general that's in charge of all British forces in North America. He will go and show the colonists how to do this. And he's going to attempt to march on Fort Duquesne. He will be ambushed by a French and Indian force, and about half of his force will be wiped out. He will be mortally wounded and die the following day. And this young Virginian then is going to have to reorganize the remnants of the force he's got and skedaddle again. This is his second defeat. Still haven't figured out his name. He went with General Braddock, was the British general. Nobody knows who he is, huh? Go figure. Can't believe that. Okay. That's how the territories kind of map out. You can see Fort Duquesne there. When he runs, there's Fort Duquesne at the forks of the Ohio. The French have a whole series of forts coming down from Lake Erie all the way down to Fort Duquesne. That's the one that's furthest south. Before the end of this French and Indian War, the British will take that fort. Well, there's the giveaway. That's George Washington we're talking about. His home is Mount Vernon. Once again, he has to come back home and tell everybody we just got whooped. He does that during the American Revolution a few times too, until he finally figures it out and gets people to cooperate. He pulled back to a place called Fort Necessity. That's where the French surrounded them. There wasn't much of a fort. There's Braddock, died in that thing. Now, one of the outcomes of this, let's go way back to the beginning of all these wars, back to King William's War. That war was being fought at the end of the 1600s, in between 1693 and I think 1697, no, 1689 and 1697, something like that. What happened at the same time up in New England in that period of time, between 1689 and say 1687? At least one person in this class has a book about it. I'm pretty sure. There are about 4 or 5 books about this subject that people were fighting over. Say it really loud. The Salem witch trials. Now you can see something about these witch trials. All these people in New England were scared out of their socks about the Indians and scared about the war, wondering, why is this happening to us? They were pretty by the book Christians, and they started thinking God's punishing us for something. That made it all, you always want somebody to blame. Must be the witches. That's one explanation for why those witch trials went so far before someone with common sense said, stop, and stop them from doing it anymore. While this is happening, that was happening early on, way back, before any of these wars, back when the British were having their civil wars, New England formed a group to defend themselves because the English weren't defending them. And they called that the New England Confederation. Write that down if you haven't already. Last class, I think we mentioned it. purely a defensive group. And it was only Massachusetts and what is now New Hampshire and Connecticut that got together to do this. And it fell apart because the colonies had a lot of trouble agreeing with each other about things. But it lasted for a while. Now when we get to the 7 Years' War, to the French and Indian War, if that's what you want to call it, we're going to have another grouping like that. It's going to be much larger. It's going to include Connecticut, Maryland, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, New York, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island. And they're going to get together up in Albany, New York, and they call it the Albany Congress of 1754. And a fellow by the name of Benjamin Franklin is going to be one of the leaders of this conference. And they're going to come up with a plan that they call the Albany Plan of Union. They're not setting up their own country or anything. They're trying to build some kind of defensive thing. But they have to work out who's going to run it, how it'll work, all of that. They're going to send that suggestion to the King of England. They're not looking for independence. They're going to ask for the approval of the crown. They're going to send it back to all the colonies to ask the colonies to approve it. And the strange thing is that the first people to disapprove it wasn't the Crown of England at all. It were all the colonies. They didn't want to be tightly connected. They didn't want to have to follow what all other colonies wanted them to do. So they rejected it out of hand. But the Albany Plan of Union is going to plant a seed in some people's mind of something that could possibly be done in the future. That happens in 1754, right at the beginning of the French and Indian War. Benjamin Franklin's proposal. Okay, that map's got everything you ever needed to know about the rest of the French and Indian War. Eventually, General Braddock's dead. They're going to replace him, well, with 2 or 3 generals. They keep firing him until they get one that can do the job. But they'll finally get Jeffrey Amherst, and he's going to launch attacks on the fort at Louisbourg, which the British had given back to the French after the last war. Then he's going to launch overland attacks on Fort Duquesne and take Fort Duquesne. He's going to launch attacks on British outposts along Lake Ontario. They're going to go down the St. Lawrence River. They're going to take what they started calling Montreal. I don't think it was really called Montreal in 1760. From the other direction will come another element of his force down up the St. Lawrence. They'll get to Quebec, which is a city up on high cliffs that should have been impregnable, but the British will find a way up to the top of those cliffs and seize Quebec in 1759. They will meet from the other direction General Amherst's main force at Montreal, and they will take Montreal at the end of 1760. And that's about the end of the fight, as far as the Americas are concerned. Now this 7 Years' War goes on for about 3 more years while other countries settle their differences. So they won't have a treaty ending this war until 1763. It's called the Treaty of Paris. You might want to write that one down. Aside from the Treaty of Utrecht, there's no treaties I want you to remember right now, but the Treaty of Paris had some very, very important results. The French were soundly defeated and realized they couldn't hang on to their colonies, so the French agreed to pull totally out of North America. So that's the end of French official presence. There's French people there, but the French government pulls out. And most of their colonies that could be associated with America, some of the islands and what have you. That's the biggest thing that happens. The second biggest thing that happens as a result of this, second it's fair to say, the French and the English have expended incredible amounts of money fighting this war, both in Europe and in the Americas. It's going to break the French eventually. The English, it's going to cause them to start looking for where they're going to make money to pay for all their expenses, and they decide, what the heck, we were defending the Americans, so let the Americans pay for it. They start they have this idea that they'll crank down on the Navigation Acts and thereby make some more money off the American colonies. But the war is not all the way over. The French and the British and some of their allies have all signed this Treaty of Paris. Who got left out? Who's been fighting in this war that's not mentioned in the treaty? They were very important to the French. That's a hint. And the French promised them, when we win this war, the great white father will give you wonderful things. Who are they? Who was left out? Who didn't sign the treaty?
Indians.
The Indians. And you don't turn them on and off like a light switch. And they're really unhappy because their source of all the goodies and everything has just picked up and left them sitting in the lurch. And now the British have replaced the French at all the outposts out along the western border of the colonies, and they are unhappy. And as a result of that, one particular tribe, the Ottawas, I think, are going to rise up and they're going to pick on one English outpost, formerly French outpost, and they're basically going to wipe it out. I think they take some prisoners. Those, by the way, this list you can look at on the slides, all the other places they fought. In Europe, in India, Africa. We're going to call this Pontiac's War. He was an Ottawa leader. It wasn't an organized uprising of all the Indian tribes, but there were a whole lot of copycats. As soon as they went after one outpost, other tribes did the same thing. The Miamis, Menomis, Ojibwas, Potawatomis, the Hurons, they're all going to attack British outposts, and a lot of them are lost. So Britain, who was busy loading their soldiers up on ships to go home to mom and daddy, have to make a U-turn and go out and settle this. Now the main part of the fighting will take place in 1763, and the British will, in fact, restore order. But there's a couple little twists to restoring order. The fighting is settled. There was a British government official named Sir William Johnson, who was the British Indian agent for a lot of this area, and they weren't listening to his advice. They probably wouldn't have had as much trouble if they had. But they're going to regain control. Now, who do they blame for this Indian trouble? Who would you imagine the British, the British want out of this. This is costing money, right? We want to go home. Our soldiers' parents want them home. Who would they blame for starting this conflict? The colonists. They blame the colonists for this, for not getting along with the Indians. So they're going to do a couple of things. First of all, they're going to try and figure out a way to squeeze the colonists for money. But second of all, they're going to say, okay, we're going to solve this whole problem. They're going to draw a line. By the way, they fired General Amherst before it was all over, replaced him with General Gage. We'll talk about that in a minute. They're going to draw a great big line down the Appalachian mountain chain, all the way south, down to Georgia. And they're going to say, colonists, you've got to stay on the east side of this line. On the west side of this line, the Indians can live. And of course, since land was a big thing in everybody's mind in the colonies, there wasn't enough to go around, they're really going to resent that. And the Indians are going to totally ignore it. Lines on maps didn't mean anything to them. So what if we get out of this? We get increasing discomfort between the English and the Americans over money, over Indian uprisings and things like that. You got that Albany Convention, which shows that the colonies could get together and cooperate to some extent, although it finally went down the drain because they couldn't agree on enough things. You'd already much earlier had the New England Confederation 2 times that some colonies started trying to get together, not looking for independence, looking for defense mainly. France is out of the picture, at least for the time being. England's really unhappy about money. They spend a lot of money, not only in the Americas, also in other parts of Europe. Had some interesting things happen during this war. There was a little island called Minorca. Now, if you were a fairly affluent student, there's an island next to it called Mallorca. And that's where people go for spring break, if they've got the money to do it. But Minorca had a British fort on it, and the French went after Minorca, and they're going to capture it. The British Navy sent a small fleet or a large squadron, whatever you want to call it, up there. The British admiral had bad weather, had a lot of damage to his ships, decided he needed to go back to Gibraltar where they had their base and fix the ships. He was court-martialed for cowardice and shot, which was shocking because you didn't get to be an admiral at 1 if you weren't pretty good at it, and 2 if you weren't rich. He was a very influential man. And what the British often did was, to show their disapproval, they would sentence you to death, and then they'd go to the king, and the king would pardon you, and it would be over with. But this was King George II, kind of a German kind of guy. And they went to the king, and the king didn't like the Navy anyway. And so when they said, well, will you pardon this guy so we don't have to shoot him? He said, hell no, that was your verdict, carry it out. So they tied him with a chair on the ship and shot him. Admiral Byng. I kind of like that, because that might explain why British admirals didn't tend to give up when they were fighting very often. If you get shot for giving up. So, what have we got? We've had a little bit of unity in between some of the colonies. We've got the development of kind of an American character as opposed to English. You've got the British getting ready to do something they hadn't done for a long time. Remember, we went through this period of what we call, you might want to write this down, benign neglect. That means that it's like a benign tumor, it's not cancerous. Now they're going to start paying attention again. They're going to start enforcing the Navigation Acts. They're going to start trying to squeeze money out of the colonies one way or another, and the colonies aren't going to like it. They also drew that line down the mountains and said you can't go west of that line, and the colonies don't like that. No one is yelling about independence. They're yelling about, we have certain rights as English citizens and you're violating our rights. The first thing that's going to happen is they're going to get a new prime minister by the name of Grenville, and he's going to pass some laws in Parliament cranking down on the Navigation Acts. There'll be a series of them, and we'll talk about them in next class in a lot more detail, and that's what your notes are about, among other things in your readings. First, they'll slap a tax they call the Revenue Act of 1764. It's not a high tax or anything, and it's no higher than, in fact, the older tax on the goods was higher than this. They reduced it a little bit. They figured nobody would scream if they reduced the tax. The big difference, though, is now they're enforcing it because the colonists weren't paying the tax at all. They're ignoring it. So if you ask why they're angry, it's because they're enforcing the law, not because of the level of the tax. And the British are going to start doing things, figuring out ways to enforce this law. They'll use the Navy, of course, for all of it. That's part of the Navigation Acts. They're also going to pass a law, and I'll explain it next time around, saying that when you pay British taxes, you have to use cash. You can't use promissory notes, or different banks and different trading houses made their own money. All it was kind of like a giant IOU that said, you can get this much in goods from our company, that sort of thing. So they there was no monetary system. They didn't have a set bit of coinage except for English money, but nobody had English money in the Americas. They didn't need it. They were doing fine. They bartered. They used letters, promissory notes, and things like that to buy things. I kind of always made fun of them. You know, a farmer coming in wants a bag of sugar, so he's got a pig under each arm. You know, here, take these pigs. I need that bag of sugar. That sort of thing. It wasn't quite that crude, and they were very, very wealthy businessmen. And they're going to be the first people that are affected, not the man on the street. The Revenue Act we're talking about, sometimes they call it the sugar tax, because that's one of the things that was being taxed. They didn't raise the tax rate. They actually lowered it. But they started actually collecting it, because the British Navy had nothing better to do, so why not use the Navy to keep smugglers from coming in and out? And the people that are hurt to begin with are the big trading houses, the wealthy people. And suddenly someone's grabbing them for money, and they really don't like it. Guys like John Hancock, for example, one of the wealthiest men in the world at that time. So when you start hearing them complain, they're not really talking about freedom, because for all intents and purposes, they've been free all along, and it's all about money. Anybody got any questions as far as we are? Okay, I'm going to add 10 points to everybody's quiz 3. That's because of that one bad question. Even if you didn't miss that one. I'm not going back to look and see who missed which. Quiz 4 is out there. The readings are out there. The notes are out there now. They weren't out there before. Look at them. The thing you need to spend the most time is looking at the readings, because that's what the next quiz will be about. But take a look at I mentioned a specific place in OpenStax to take a look at. Do that. That'll be part of the quiz when it comes along. That's part of the reading assignment. Look over the lecture notes so you know where we are when we carry on from here. And that's about it. Finish the quiz by the end of the week. I don't think this class, I haven't even looked, to tell you the truth, because these quizzes grade themselves since they're multiple choice. I don't know if anybody here hasn't done the quiz or not, but I kind of got nasty with the last class and said, I'm not going to reopen that quiz anymore if you can't get it done on time. I mean, we all have our responsibilities and all that. We need to get the quiz done by the deadline. If anyone hasn't done it, I'm going to turn it on this one last time so that people can catch up. But after that, you got to keep up with those quizzes. And it's very clearly marked when the deadline is. So, get them done.
Came here for accounting.
I know you're just like you are every class.
Yes,
Every day,
I don't need
Monday,
to-
Wednesday, and Friday.
Yes, I don't need to say that anymore.
You don't need to say that anymore. Just come in and sit down. Make yourself at home. Have a really great day. Enjoy the week. You guys coming up for your first exam yet?
Actually, we take the exam online and before the deadline, but we don't have to take it in class.
Oh, boy, you guys, what?